Welcome. Thank you for joining us here today on Zoom. I am Jeff Garris. I am the Outreach Director with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. I'm joined here today by my colleagues at PBPC, our Director, Marc Stier, and our Senior Policy Analyst, Diana Polson. We're really excited today because, as you know, yesterday was the governor's budget address. It was delayed a day due to snow, which was kind of intriguing since the whole address was pre-recorded, as you saw from the high-end production values of multiple angles and additional shots in there. It was actually a very nice looking address. We at PBPC thought it was really one of the governor's best addresses. The tone was just perfect for the kind of address that he was giving. We were excited by a lot of the ideas and things that he's proposed and made his priorities for the fiscal year 2021-22 state budget of Pennsylvania. We'll be taking a quick look today, sort of an initial overview of what the governor has proposed for his budget. Obviously, this is the starting point. Yesterday was sort of the kickoff in this football game. We'll see how long we go from here until the end of the fourth quarter, which, as you know, under our state constitution is that by July 1st, the state budget is supposed to be enacted and approved and implemented. It's supposed to be a balanced budget with income and expenditures roughly equal. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We are recording this today, so we'll have this video available for our partners and allies if you want to watch it again, or if for folks who are not able to make it, you can also share it with other folks in your organizations. We're going to have all of the lines muted here today. And if you have a question, you can type that into the chat box. We will be taking questions. If you have a question and you want to ask it yourself, that'd be perfect. Just type in the chat box the word question, and I will follow up with you and let you know when we're ready to unmute your line so you can ask your question directly. If you have a question that you would just like to submit, have me ask them, you can type in the entire question in there, but we'd be happy to have folks be able to ask their questions directly. So again, I'm going to turn it over to the Director of Pennsylvania Budget and Policy, Marc Stier, to give us an initial walkthrough of Governor Wolf's proposed budget. Marc?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate your attention to what we have to say about the state budget. Governor Wolf presented his 2021-2022 budget under the cloud of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as you know, has been affecting our state and country and damaging our economy, creating a recession that's been very painful for so many people in Pennsylvania. In response to that, the governor's proposed a budget that addresses taxes, education, wages, and also criminal justice issues in a way that we think will help all Pennsylvanians thrive, no matter where they live or what they look like. His proposals will break down some of the economic, racial, gender, and immigration status inequities that for too long have limited the ability of too many Pennsylvanians to thrive. It's not perfect by any means, but we're going to focus today on the things that we think are bold and really important about the governor's budget. And we're going to do this in a broad overview. The rollout of the budget has been a little crazy. We did not get details of the budget until late yesterday. So there's a lot we have not been able to figure out about how spending is distributed in different categories. We know there are a lot of increases in many areas that we think are important, although mainly small areas and small increases rather. But we're going to be focusing on some of the very big things right now. First, let me give you a little overview of the whole budget. It's a $37.8 billion budget proposal. The biggest increases for education spending, about $1.6 billion. There's small increases in many important areas, including for intellectual disabilities, for childcare, for other human services, which we probably won't be able to spend much time talking about today. But we should say, with the exception of things we talk about today, the increases are fairly small, and the budget itself is fairly austere in many areas. For example, in the area of environmental protection, there aren't major increases, and we know that this is an area where the state has been underinvesting very much. Same thing with regard to transportation. There aren't major increases in this budget, and it's another area where the state has been underinvesting. It's a balanced budget. From what we can tell from our initial look, it's balanced by a couple of very important revenue lines in addition to the usual ones. There's a personal income tax increase of $2.9 billion. If you compare that to the increased education spending, you can see that $1.3 billion of that $2.9 billion is used for other things besides education. There's a corporate tax increase of $208 million, which I'll talk about later. The budget assumes that the enhanced FMAP rate, which is the rate at which the federal government helps pay for Medicaid and medical assistance, will continue throughout the whole fiscal year. That would bring in $2.3 billion. And I should just say for a moment that this increase is projected to continue as long as the emergency, federal emergency, stays in effect. Should President Biden decide that the federal emergency related to COVID-19 has ended, then the enhanced FMAP would not necessarily continue. On the other hand, we are expecting aid for states and local governments from the Congress, as President Biden has proposed. So one way or the other, we're probably going to get some federal funding, and that will be necessary, as at least $2.3 billion in federal funding is projected as part of the revenue sources for this budget. And then there's an increase in the minimum wage, which brings in about $120 million in new revenues or in savings in state spending. Turning first to taxes, what we're going to do in this presentation is give you some context for this budget. And the context for the tax proposal is something we've been pointing to for very many years, that the Pennsylvania tax system is upside down, that the rate at which people in the middle and at the bottom pay state and local taxes is double that of the top. Top 1% pays 6% of their income in state and local taxes. Their average income is about $1.5 million. The middle third pays 10.3% of their income in state and local taxes, and their average income is about $60,000. And the bottom 20%, sorry, I went too fast. The bottom 20% pays 13.8% of their income in state and local taxes, and the cutoff for being in the bottom 20% is only $23,000 a year. So that's a horribly unfair tax system. And it's also one that doesn't bring in as much revenue as it should, because rich people make a lot more money than poor and middle income people. And if we're not going to tax them at the same rate as poor and middle income people, we're not going to get as much revenue. So what does the governor propose? First, he proposes the increase in the personal tax rate from 3.07% to 4.49%. And then he proposes to expand tax forgiveness. Now, some of you may not know, we've had a tax forgiveness program for decades. And what that program does, it allows the state government to exempt people who are disabled or who are poor from paying some portion of their state taxes. This is the one area in which the uniformity clause has an exemption. Now, you probably know the uniformity clause requires that everyone pays the same rate of taxes on any category of income. And that's why there's one tax rate in the state, as opposed to New York, which has graduated tax rates. If your income is higher, you pay a higher marginal tax rate on higher levels of income. We can't do that in Pennsylvania, but we do have a tax forgiveness program. And what the governor proposes is to expand that tax forgiveness program, and instead of having a fixed cutoff for the program, to gradually reduce the tax credit you get through the tax forgiveness program. So this chart shows you what people will pay, how much at what levels the personal income tax is reduced because of the tax forgiveness program. So take, for example, a single person with one dependent. If their income is $25,000 or less, they will have 100% tax forgiveness. Tax forgiveness will gradually decline so that it ends at $59,000 a year income. Similarly, for a married couple with two dependents, the maximum for 100% tax forgiveness is $50,000. And then the percentage of tax forgiveness one gets declines gradually as one's income goes up. It's basically a 1% drop for every $500 in income, until at $84,000, there's no more tax forgiveness credit. We have not done the calculation yet to figure out how this program will change the overall distribution of state and local taxes, which I pointed to at the beginning of my talk about taxes. We will be doing that soon. My off the cuff guess is that it will not eliminate the unfairness of Pennsylvania's tax system, but will reduce it quite a lot. And we very much appreciate the governor putting forward a really bold proposal to make our taxes more fair and also to raise more revenue. As I pointed out, it raises about $2.9 billion in new revenues. We do have some idea of the impact of the proposal on taxpayers. Taxes will go down for about 40% of Pennsylvania families. They'll stay the same for another 27% of Pennsylvania families. They'll only go up for the most well-off 33% of Pennsylvania families. So if you see people saying this is a major tax increase and it's a terrible thing for that reason, I very much urge you to push back, whether you see it on Twitter or Facebook or in conversation with your friends. For most Pennsylvanians, this is not a tax increase at all. It's only a tax increase for 33% of families in Pennsylvania. I did not include a slide that shows you the increase in income inequality over the last 20 and 30 years. I'm pretty sure you know how much more unequal our state and our whole country has become in terms of income. That inequality has been deepened in the last year because of the pandemic. People who are in the top third of families in Pennsylvania have been not seeing their incomes decline. In some cases, they've seen their incomes go up, whereas people below that have seen a drop in their incomes. And people in the top third of Pennsylvania families have been saving a lot of money because they can't spend it on many things they usually spend it on. So this is a response to the pandemic, but also to the long-term inequity that has plagued our state for a very long time. There's also a corporate tax proposal. You've heard us talking about the Delaware loophole for many years that allows multi-state and international corporations that are based outside of Pennsylvania to escape from paying any Pennsylvania corporate net income tax. 73% of corporations that operate in Pennsylvania pay no tax at all. Combined reporting, which I'm not going to go into detail, is a way to close that loophole. So we will no longer be talking about 73% of corporations not paying any corporate taxes if this passes. The governor does propose to reduce the corporate tax rate from 9.9% to 8.99% on January 1st, 2022, with further gradual reductions until the rate reaches 5.99%. Our view at PBPC is that closing the Delaware loophole is a really good idea. Reducing corporate tax rates a little bit is a really good idea. Reducing them to 6% we think is too great a reduction, and we would urge the General Assembly to not include that portion of the governor's proposal in the tax code this year.
So Mark, just have a question related to what you're talking about now. From Crystal, the question is the increase for the wealthiest 23% or 33%?
33%.
Okay, thanks. There are a couple other questions coming in, so when you're ready to take some more, we'll go to those questions.
Are there other questions?
I'll let you proceed.
I could stop for a minute and talk a little bit more about answer questions on taxes if you want, or we could just wait till the end. What's your preference, Jeff?
There's another question that's actually related to some federal initiatives, not directly related to taxes right now. There is a question from Pat Albright as well, but we can take that now if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay. Pat, I'm going to unmute your line. You can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. The question is, and you probably, I don't know, this isn't related to taxes per se, but I was wondering what the budget will mean for implementation of the City Poverty Action Plan, including in their statewide agenda, which includes increasing TANF benefits, it includes reinstating the general assistance, increasing earned income tax credit, and so on. Any thoughts on how
as far as I know, none of those proposals are included in the governor's plan. I think the governor's plan will benefit low-income Philadelphians, but the proposals are separate from the ones you mentioned. Okay, so let me go on to education, and we can take other questions at the end after I finish and Diana finishes. So here's a little context for the education proposal. Pennsylvania ranks 44th in the percentage of K-12 education funding that comes from the state. There we are down at the bottom. The average for all states is about 43%. We're down at about 38%. One result of that is tremendous inequality in how we fund education. You've heard me say many times that the richest third of schools in Pennsylvania spend 33% more per student than the poorest third of schools. And we also have a serious racial inequity problem. If you look at basic education funding, you'll see that the schools with a high share of students of color get much less from the state than schools with a low share of students of color. So what does the governor propose to do about this? First, he proposes that all current basic education funding will be distributed through the fair funding formula. If I go back to the previous slide, you will see that we divided basic education funding into two parts. There's base funding, and that's based on what schools got from the state in 2014, 2015. Since the fair funding formula was introduced, all new funding has gone through the fair funding formula, and you can see that new funding is much more equally funded to schools with a high share of students of color than a low share of students of color. Now, what the governor is proposing is basically to eliminate this dark blue area, this base funding that's been fixed by just the amount school districts got in 2015, and put all the funding that goes from states to local school districts to what's called the Basic Education Fund through the fair funding formula. What that will do is raise the bar on the right, and I don't know if it'll lower the bar on the left, but it will equalize those bars. And if we had a similar chart with regard to poverty, percentage of students who are poor, we would see a similar equalization. And that's because all the money will now be going through the fair funding formula. Now, there will also be, I left out a word, it should be 1.15 billion in additional BEF funding is provided to schools that lose funding. If you put all the money through the formula and you do nothing else, a number of schools districts will get less. And what the governor wants to do is not disrupt school districts that have been counting on state funding for a number of years. So there's additional 1.15 billion that will be used to make sure that no school district actually loses money. And then there's an additional $200 million in basic education funding that ensures that all school districts will receive some increase. Now, what that means is the share of state funding to different schools will be very much equalized. We'll see a reduction in the inequity by race and the inequity by wealth or poverty of school districts, but it won't be totally eliminated. There will be some hangover. We will be doing a detailed analysis very soon that looks at how far this proposal goes to reducing inequity with regard to income and race in school funding. We think it's a really great idea, however, and I think it's politically reasonable for this governor to be putting forward a proposal that doesn't create insuperable obstacles to passing the proposal by actually taking money away from school districts. There's also a proposal to reform the charter school law. The goal of that is to make sure that charter schools are held accountable, that there's better procedures to ensure that schools that are successful continue and those that are not are no longer funded by the state, to ensure that charter schools don't expand willy-nilly without some local school district influence, to ensure that they aren't paid more than the cost of education. And that's particularly true with regard to cyber charters, which get a great deal of money through the charter school funding formula, but which very much hurts local school districts, ultimately has to pay for it, but the amount they get seems to be disproportionate to the cost of education. The governor is again putting forward a proposal to increase minimum teacher salaries to, I think Diana may know the number, I think it's $45,000 or $48,000 a year. I forget.
Yeah, I think it's 45.
Yeah. There's also $200 million in special education, $300 million for early childhood education. There's changes in the educational tax credit program. This is a program that allows businesses to get a deduction from their taxes to contribute to private schools. And that has been a program that we believe has been abused in many cases, with money going in unaccountable ways to schools that do things that the public should not be supporting. So there's some changes to make that program a little more responsible. And the last two bullets here repeat what's on the last slide, so I don't need to go over them, sorry. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about higher education. The governor is proposing it should be 199 million in Nellie Bly scholarships. These are scholarships to help Pennsylvania's high school graduates and others to attend the PASSHE schools. It's funded by a transfer from the Racehorse Development Fund. A little context for that program is that state system funding relative to the gross state product has been falling drastically since the 1980s. It's down 38% below where it was in 1983-84. That's one reason why you hear so much about student debt, because we've been asking students to pick up the cost of higher education through tuition, whereas in the past, students could count on the state picking up a big share of the cost of education. If someone who graduated college in 1983 says, I don't like this idea of helping students with student debt, you should remind them that when they went to college, a great deal of the cost of their education was picked up, if they went to a state school, by the state. And that share has declined, and as a result, tuition's been going up so much. Just to give you another idea of how much we spend, how much less we spend on colleges than we should, we spend $2.69 billion a year in prisons and only $1.76 billion on colleges in this state. And that's there's a causal relationship there, to my mind. The lack of educational opportunity is one reason we have higher crime rates than we should, in addition to incarceration policies that are unnecessarily punitive and ineffective. I mentioned that the funding for the Nellie Bly Scholarship will come from the Racehorse Development Fund. Right now, that fund provides a huge amount to the horse racing industry. Most of the money goes to the purses for the horses that win those races, and those horses tend to be owned by very, very rich people, most of them who do not live in Pennsylvania, half of them who don't live in Pennsylvania, including some Saudi princes who really don't need a subsidy from the Pennsylvania taxpayers. So we're spending more on horses than we are on kids, and it's really time to stop that. And with that, I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to Diana Polson, the Senior Policy Analyst at Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we have been advocating for a long time that Pennsylvania needs to increase the minimum wage. And the governor, once again, has made this proposal in this budget. So he proposes to increase the minimum wage to $12 an hour this July. And this would increase yearly by 50 cents until it reaches $15 an hour by 2027. Other key things to note around this proposal, it would establish one fair wage by eliminating the tipped minimum, so that tipped workers are no longer having to work for the ridiculously low wage of $2.83 an hour. Estimates are that this increase in the wage would generate about $116 million in personal income and sales and use tax. Next slide. So you all have likely seen this image before, but it shows, how all of the states surrounding Pennsylvania have raised their minimum wage, but we are still stuck at the federal minimum at $7.25 an hour, which is obviously just an impossible wage to live on. So just in 2021, at least 20 other states have increased their minimum wages. Next slide. So raising the wage under this proposal would raise wages for 27.5% of Pennsylvanians by 2027, and that's more than 6 million people. So it would obviously have, a huge impact on, a huge portion of the Pennsylvania population. Next slide. So this graph just shows how much more money Pennsylvanians would earn with this increase over the next 5 years. This additional money would go directly back into the economy as people will spend their money on life's necessities. And so this is an important part of the governor's plan to improve the economy. Next slide. So the governor has other ideas around stabilizing the economy and helping us recover from the impacts of the pandemic. This includes what he's calling the Back to Work PA plan. And this is similar to his proposal last year that he called Restore PA, which some of you might remember. The Back to Work PA plan would invest $3 billion over the next 10 years. And the aim of it is to support businesses and workers to help them recover from the pandemic. So like his Restore PA plan, this would be paid for through a severance tax, which we know is an ongoing battle in Pennsylvania. The idea would be to borrow money to fund these programs, then use the severance tax to pay it back. In terms of how this money would be spent, the governor here is talking about recommendations from the Workforce Command Center on addressing key barriers to employment, namely childcare, training, transportation, licensure, and reentry. Back to Work PA focuses specifically on addressing barriers related to childcare and job training. Childcare subsidies would be expanded under this plan. And funding would also be available to help centers expand to non-traditional hours for childcare and for employers who want to provide childcare on site. Apprenticeship is a key strategy from this administration. We know that this is an effective workforce development strategy where individuals can earn money while they learn on the job. And several years ago, the governor established the Apprenticeship and Training Office and has an aim to double apprenticeship over several years and expand this model into industries besides just construction. The governor also calls for investments in expanding the supply chain, which saw disruptions as a result of COVID, and invest in distressed communities. Another thing is, part of this plan is expanding broadband in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So there's a lot to the human service budget, but I'm just gonna note a couple things. Perhaps the biggest investment here is for child care. The governor is proposing an investment of $87 million in federal funds for child care works to support child care centers in Pennsylvania, which were hard hit during the pandemic. He includes $1 million for legal services to support low-income families. There's funding to move an additional 732 individuals with an intellectual disability or autism from the waiting list through the community living waiver program and 100 through the consolidated waiver program. We all know that, with the aging of the population, there's a greater demand for direct care workers. So he proposes comprehensive training for direct care workers. And the last thing I wanted to note on human services is he proposes $1 million for housing security to decrease kids in foster care due to unstable housing. And this is one of the things that we found when we did research on gas drilling in Greene County, Pennsylvania, that we did maybe 5 or 7 years ago. When we did interviews down there, we heard that human service officials, were saying that their largest costs related to the drilling boom were foster care costs that were caused by increasing rents. Kids were being removed from their families basically because of poverty reasons and because the families had housing insecurity, which is obviously devastating for families and children to be separated on top of having that housing insecurity. So I'm glad the state has acknowledged this as a problem. Not sure how far $1 million will go here, but we'll see moving forward. Next slide. So the governor also proposes a number of criminal justice reforms connected to this budget. The first is fair funding for state police coverage. This would be a fair service fee to every municipality that would be assessed, and it'd be weighted for those who rely kind of more heavily on state police. He also proposes reforms related to law enforcement, including community policing improvements, reforms related to bail and pretrial, particularly around the uneven use of monetary cash bail, which has disproportionately impacted communities of color. He also is proposing probation reform, and Pennsylvania actually has many more individuals on probation compared to the national average, and this reform would focus on making sure probation isn't overused in the state. He also proposes comprehensive clean slate legislation. There's a clean slate law in Pennsylvania which seals cases and eliminates the stigma surrounding conviction, but Governor Wolf hopes to improve this law. Medical release reform would release elderly and sick individuals into long-term care facilities, which would make prisons less crowded. And Governor Wolf is also proposing to establish compensation for wrongly convicted individuals. Wrongly convicted people spend an average of 9 years behind bars before proving their innocence nationally, but in Pennsylvania, it's 14 years on average. So Wolf is hoping for Pennsylvania to join 35 other states that provide at least $50,000 per year for a wrongful conviction. Next slide. So there's obviously a lot of other things in the budget, but a couple things that stood out to me I wanted to note. The governor about a year or more ago expressed his support for legalizing adult use cannabis. Previous estimates show that this could raise about a little under $600 million a year. In this budget, he proposes to use this revenue to support historically disadvantaged small businesses through grant funding and support restorative justice programs to help those harmed by the criminalization of marijuana. Yesterday, I don't know how many of you guys were able to get on the call, but it was helpful for me to hear Morgan Plant talk about public health. In the state, she was talking yesterday about Pennsylvania's public health infrastructure and how COVID kind of exposed our inadequacies here. She gave the example of how West Virginia has a health department in every county of their state, which has helped them in dealing with the coronavirus. Pennsylvania only has 10 county or municipal health departments. So Wolf is proposing $8.3 million to both help support those departments and to create a new health department in Delaware County in 2022. And the last thing I had to note was that the governor is proposing $1 billion that would be used as grants to schools who need to clean up lead and asbestos in their buildings. With that, I'll send it back over to Jeff, and we can answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Diana. A couple questions here in the chat that I'll pose to both of you. You can take a stab at those if you want to. And other folks, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, just please type question in there and we'll get you unmuted to ask it directly. So there's a question from Art. The question is that one of the big federal initiatives that didn't get as much focus was on climate and environmental issues. The question here is, where is that, and will there be federal funds for states that continue the emphasis on climate-related issues?
So one thing we did not talk about is the governor has proposed that Pennsylvania enter RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. RGGI is a program that a number of states around us, that's why it's called regional, have adopted, that sets limits, basically sets limits on how much you can, greenhouse gases, energy producers, that's mostly electricity producers, can emit into the atmosphere. And it basically says in order to do that, you have to get a permit, and those permits can be bought and sold on the market. The estimates that we've seen suggest that joining RGGI will reduce the greenhouse gases emitted in Pennsylvania by 20 to 30% over the next 10 to 15 years. We very much support the entry of Pennsylvania into RGGI, and I think that's the most dramatic example of a really effective way of dealing with climate change that Governor Wolf has been promoting. We know there's some opposition to it from energy producers, but we think that the program the governor has been able to make that decision on his own under existing statutes, so it's going to happen, and we think that's very much a good thing. And that's the major climate initiative of the Wolf administration.
And there's a question related to, I think, Diana's presentation. Question is regarding what you mentioned about discussion on public health. Question is, was that recorded?
Yeah, it was the call yesterday with Morgan Plant and Mark. We have it on our website. Maybe someone could drop the link in.
Yes, this is Jeff. I'll put that in the link in the chat right now. That takes you to our budget resources page, which I noted in the chat is something that we just got up online yesterday on the PBPC website. It is a page where we're going to be putting all of the information related to the 2021-22 state budget on that page. The link is there in the chat. There's a video of post-budget address conversation that Marc Stier had with a couple of other experts in Pennsylvania, getting their initial reactions to the governor's budget address. That's what Diana's talking about there right now. You can find that video on that page. We have links to the governor's budget, to other resources coming from the Commonwealth. We also have some PBPC analysis. We'll be continuing to add to this page. You may want to save that link and have it handy on your browser so you can check in every morning to see if we've put something new up there about the state budget. But we will be adding to that over the next few weeks and months. Another question we had come in the chat, question from Art, is on the topic of social and criminal justice, that this is also clearly a priority of the Biden administration. And so there's a question here is, what increases may be provided in the governor's budget proposal that would help to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in the state government?
I think Diana talked
I don't know.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. You can go ahead,
Yeah.
Diana.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I don't know the answer to that. So maybe you have something to add, Mark.
I think the most important one you mentioned is with regard to criminal justice reforms. And the other one is this major change in how we fund our schools. As I mentioned, racial inequity in the funding of our schools is just horrible, and it's terribly striking when you look at the data. I think the governor's proposal to run most of the money for basic education funding through the funding formula will reduce the much, if not all, of the racial inequity and how we fund our schools. So that's a very welcome step forward, and a really major attempt to address racial inequity in the state budget.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Diana, and thank you to you, Art, for the question. I think there's another question here, follow-up from Art. Realistically, how obstructionist are Republicans going to be on this budget? Where can we lobby, do advocacy to have the greatest impact? What can we do to help tip the balance?
We don't expect, and we have not seen the Republicans sing the praises of this budget. I think there are many respects in which they will not support it. On the other hand, some of these proposals just make common sense, and we think voters in many Republican districts will find these to be good ideas. Are We the People campaign is going to be launching a major initiative to help enact the governor's budget, or certain the central elements of it we've talked about today. So I would stay tuned for that. You will see ways in which you can help contact legislators, your own legislators, or help us reach voters and citizens and other residents in Republican legislative districts where we want to try to encourage legislators to support these plans. We're formulating the details of that campaign now. We'll be rolling out rolling it out in the next week or so. So you will see that soon. But you're right. This is not going to be an easy lift.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask quickly here before we wrap up, just type the word question and I'll unmute you to ask the question directly. I did put the link there to the We the People website where you can follow along with what the We the People campaign is going to be doing. I'll try to put their Facebook link in there as well for folks. All right, I don't see any other questions.
All right,
Sorry,
let me
Mark.
just say one last thing, Jeff. And here's the last question. I think one thing everyone should recognize is this is a really bold initiative from the governor. We're really grateful that he's taken these steps, but that he's taken these steps in part is the result of work that activists around the state have been doing through our We the People campaign the last couple of years. The tax fairness proposals, the education proposals, very much echo what We the People and the PBPC has been calling for. People who've been active in the We the People campaign and contacting legislators and lifting up the ideas of tax fairness and fair education funding have contributed to creating an environment in which Governor Wolf felt that he could advance these proposals again. He advanced some of them in his first year in office. They were not enacted, but he's brought some of them back in even bolder forms this year. And I think activism from Pennsylvanians is some reason that it's happened. So you should all pat yourself on the back for the work you've been doing, and keep being engaged as we let you know how you can be effective. And hopefully we can at least get some of the key elements of this budget this year and the rest of it sooner rather than later. So thank you.
There is a question that just came in, Mark, asking if you could elaborate a bit about how the governor envisions increasing the state's capacity for public health.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that shocked me when all of a sudden we started talking about public health is that state spending for public health has been flat funded for 8 years. And if you want to know why this state, as well as most other states, has not been able to cope as effectively with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's because we haven't been investing in public health. So, which means we didn't have the capacity to do contact tracing when there were only a few cases of the coronavirus. It means that we now don't have the capacity to vaccinate everyone. We really need to be ramping up our spending in these areas. I think the governor does that to some extent. There's been a lot of emergency money coming from the federal government to help hospitals and help healthcare providers deal with the COVID-19 virus, and now there'll be more funding to help with vaccination. When the pandemic is over, however, and we hope it'll be over sometime in the next 6 months, we need to take a serious look at the infrastructure, for public health in this state. My view is that it's very much been underfunded. It has been for many years. It's not Governor Wolf's fault. It's not the really legislature's fault. No one's been thinking about this or talking about it, and we intend to raise some questions and come up with some proposals for what the state actually needs. I did do a brief comparison of public health spending between Pennsylvania and other states, and we really rank pretty badly. Other states spend a lot more on public health. But as you've just seen, that's true with higher education, it's true with K-12 education, it's true with roads, bridges. Pennsylvania has had a long-term public investment problem in many areas, and public health is one of them. So on
Thank
that
you, Mark.
note, we can wrap up. Thank you.
I was going to say, that's a cheery way to end it, but it's been that kind of year, hasn't it? Speaking of things over the past year and heading into the next year and talking about the state budget, we at PBPC are putting together our annual budget summit. Our budget summit this year, as we sort of ended up doing somewhat last year, will be a virtual event. It'll be all online. We are planning on doing a deep dive into the governor's budget, as we do every year, with workshops on whole range of topics connected to the budget, some that are focused a lot on policy and research, others that will be talking about how to organize and mobilize to do advocacy to advance the kind of things we want to see in the state budget. To let you know, we don't have the registration page up yet. We hope to have that up, I think, sometime next week. But the dates on the calendar, we decided rather than trying to pack everything into one very, very long day on Zoom, which would probably burn folks out, that we're going to do this on 4 consecutive Thursdays. That's going to begin on Thursday, March 11th, with a morning session where we'll be looking at the governor's budget in depth. And then in the afternoon, we'll have some other sessions on that day on the 11th. We'll be doing workshops on those consecutive weeks. So it'll be March 11th, March 18th, March 25th, and then we will conclude on Thursday, April 1st. We'll have the exact times and the details and the workshops and how to register coming up very soon. But I did want to flag that for folks so you know that's coming up, and that'll be a deep look into the state budget. So again, thank you to Mark and to Diana for really presenting some helpful information here to everyone. Thank you to those of you who joined us today, those of you who asked questions. We will be sending out a copy of the slides. We'll also send out a link to the video recording of this so that if you want to share it with others in your organization, you can do so. So we want to thank you so much again for joining us. We'll be doing these meetings on Thursday afternoons, probably about every other week, with the exception of when we do our budget summit. And we'll continue to do that as we head into the spring, keeping you posted on things like the upcoming budget hearings in the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care. Bye.
See ya.